Hey everyone, this is going to be a top 5 best overall mini bike video. I will be specifically focusing on overall fun, usefulness, enjoyability, affordability, accessibility to parts and mods, as well as ease of maintenance regardless of a person's mechanical ability or experience. This list does not include drag race mini bikes, dirt bikes, pocket bikes, vintage mini bikes, or electric motorbikes. I'm also choosing to exclude mini bikes with manual transmissions, such as the Honda CT70. This top 5 list will focus on mini bikes that use a standard horizontal shaft small engine with no transmission except for centrifugal clutches, jack shafts, and or torque converters. Also, many of these mini bike companies have gone out of business, changed their names, and or sold their mini bike designs to other companies. Therefore, some of these bikes on the list may have different manufacturers and or model names, but are basically the same bikes. I will try to cover some of the more well-known names, but I may miss a few. For example, the Baja Warrior is also known as the Baja MB200, the Baja Heat, and there's also several other variants of this mini bike model. So I may not mention every particular name that a mini bike is known as. Oh, and lastly, this top 5 list does not include custom built mini bikes. There are many kits you can buy available online. It would just be too in depth to include these. With all that out of the way, let's jump right into this. Coming in at number 5 is the Coleman Ct 200U. Now first I want to go over the cons of this bike. I'd say the biggest cons of this bike would be that there's no front or rear suspension. The next thing is, for some reason, most Colemans have a 5/8 size crankshaft instead of the more traditional 3/4. It's not the end of the world. You can buy a conversion kit. But it's kind of annoying, and if you went on ahead and ordered some part for it and you try to put it on, it doesn't work. And finally, the last con, in my opinion, would be the jack shaft. I really think the torque converter is a much better option, and I really just don't see a use for a jack shaft on a bike like this. On to the pros, I would say one of the biggest, most appealing thing is the front and rear cargo rails. I think that's a pretty cool feature, especially if you ride off-road and you want to bring some stuff along with you. And lastly, I would say the availability of parts and mods. You can go online and there's just a ton of mods and parts out there for the bike that you can get. Also, the bike is pretty easy to find online. You can still buy them new. You can also buy them used, and they're priced pretty reasonable. You can usually get a used one, on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or something, anywhere between $300 or $400, and you can get them new for about $500 to $600. Coming in at number 4 on my list is the Baja Warrior. As I mentioned before, this bike has a lot of different variants, such as the Baja MB200, Baja Heat, and there's a few others out there. It's a really nice bike. It's large. Some people call it an adult-size mini bike, or a older kid, teenager-sized mini bike. And I think that's what kind of makes this one almost in a class of its own. Is it can be a pretty good off-road bike. But that kind of leads me to my first con with this bike is the fact that it doesn't have rear suspension. So if you take this thing off-road, it's going to beat you up after a while. The only other con that I can really think of for this bike would be, again, the jack shaft. I think most people that do serious riding on these things, especially off-road, the first thing they do is they swap that out for a torque converter. It'd be nice if they just came with those. Moving on to the pros, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the false storage gas tank. It's pretty neat that they did that, pretty innovative. And I think it's just very useful. You can put some tools in there. If you swapped out a torque converter, you can carry an extra torque converter belt, and it's just really handy. Next pro would have to be the charging coil system and the working headlight. Those who are not familiar with the way a charging coil system works is basically while the engine is running, the charging coils produce electricity so you can power electrical components such as the headlight. And speaking of the headlight, it's not the greatest, but it sure is handy if you're riding and you know it gets dark outside. Also helps other vehicles spot you while you're riding, and you can always upgrade it if you wanted to an LED or something that's brighter. Next pro would be the accessibility to parts. There are tons of parts you can get online. There are tons of mods you can get online, so that would be another pro, just the accessibility of these parts and mods. They're just fun mini bikes. I had one for a short time, and I remember you just feel like you're almost sitting on a Harley Davidson. They're pretty good for off-road. They're lots of fun on-road, and there's so many things you could do to it to just customize and truly make it your own. Seems like there's always a handful of used ones online. They range anywhere between $300 and $400. Although the Baja Warrior has been discontinued, you can buy its variant online, brand new, for about $600 to $700. Next up on my top 5 mini bike list, coming in at number 3, is the Manco Thunderbird. Now this one almost falls into the vintage category. I believe I read somewhere they started making these and producing them in the 60s. They continued to produce them until I believe either the late 90s or early 2000s. This is probably my personal favorite mini bike. The biggest con, however, is that they have been discontinued for almost 20 years now, and it is impossible to find any factory parts. Another con to the Manco Thunderbird were the engines that these came with. The early models came with an underpowered flathead, flat top style engine. The newer, later models came with a 4 horsepower Robin, which is a Subaru engine. The engine is great. It's a tank. However, it is an overhead cam engine. So the timing chains need to be adjusted periodically. This is beyond most people's capability. But even worse, there are no performance parts for that engine. You just can't find any. Fortunately, you can slap a Predator 212 or another Honda GX200 clone engine on there. It'll fit no problem. Another con to this bike is the terrible rear tire brake. And for those of you who are not familiar with a tire brake, the way it works is it's literally a piece of metal that scrapes against the rear tire and able to slow it down. And when it's wet or muddy outside, it basically just doesn't work at all and just becomes almost dangerous. It's kind of cool that it is a foot engaged brake, but other than that, it's pretty worthless. Another one of the biggest cons is, again, they haven't made these for almost 20 years, so they're very hard to find online. Some of the pros of the Manco Thunderbird would be the higher than normal ground clearance, which makes it fairly decent for off-road. Also, it comes with both front and rear shocks, which is pretty rare in a mini bike in this particular class. Also has a real motorcycle style gas tank, which I think is pretty cool. And with some modifications, you can make this bike one of the coolest looking and functioning mini bikes ever. You'll see here are some pictures of 2 different Manco Thunderbirds that I owned that I did some modifications to. Actually put some dirt bike wheels on it, which gave it both front and rear drum brakes, plus it gave it even higher ground clearance. I swapped them out, put a Predator on there, the torque converter, and it is probably the funnest mini bike I've ever ridden. Like I already mentioned, you cannot buy these new. No one is making them at all, or has been for several years. You can still get them occasionally online. They're not super rare just yet. I still see them for sale anywhere between $200 to $400. Coming in at number 2 is the Trailmaster MB200. Now, if this were the top 5 off-road mini bikes, this would hands down be number 1. But before we get into that, let's just talk about the cons. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Trailmaster MB200, it's very similar to a Baja Warrior. Same size tires, about same size frame. The major difference is the Trailmaster MB200 has both front and rear suspension. The first con to this mini bike, I believe, would be the false gas tank. It doesn't do anything. Unlike the Baja Warrior, where you have a storage tank, this is just an empty shell. So it's just literally there for looks. I think it would be much better at minimum if they were to do like the Baja Warrior, make it with a storage tank, or even put a real gas tank on there. You can do that. It's not too hard. I have one right now that has a Baja Warrior storage gas tank on it. I've ran that for a while. Just bought an actual motorcycle gas tank, which I'm going to put on there. So you can do it. It's not a big deal, but it'd be nice if they came from the factory with something better than just a completely fake, useless gas tank. Second con I would say about this mini bike is, since they're newer, you're going to have a hard time finding a used one for sale online. At least where I'm at, you almost never see them. And I think it's just because they're just kind of a newer bike, and there's just not a lot of used ones yet, which means you're going to have to, if you really want one, you're going to have to pay for a new one. And they run new anywhere between $900 to $1,000. The only other con I can think of with the Trailmaster MB200 would be with their first generation model. When they first came out with these, they came with jack shafts. On the second generations, they now have torque converters. So with the newer ones, I really don't have any complaint because it comes with that. Not sure if I would call this a Pro, but it does come with a 6.5 horsepower non-Hemi Honda clone engine. You can easily swap it out. It'll fit a Predator, whatever you want to put on there. 6.5 horse engine, or even the new Tilson 212cc engine. Of course, it has the headlights. It has the charging coil, which is great. Has the obviously front suspension, the rear suspension, and also on the second generations, they now have a hydraulic brake on the rear, which is great. The old ones had a drum brake, which was okay, but this one has the hydraulic now. I wish I had a front brake. That might be another con, but it is what it is. Has a nice little cargo rack there. Stock, of course, with the governor intact, it's going 35. You remove the governor, you're going 45 pretty easily. The Trailmaster MB200 is definitely a larger teen or adult size mini bike. Wouldn't recommend jumping it, but it can handle just about any terrain off-road. Again, there's tons of parts available. Many of the parts are compatible with the Baja Warrior, such as the tire size, the different cables and such. They're highly modifiable, and you can really customize it to fit your own needs. Again, they're great off-road bikes. They're great dual sport bikes, or even a street bike. I have recently fitted my Trailmaster with signals, brake light, and a horn, and have applied to the DMV to make it street legal. Okay, before I announce my number 1 on my top 5 mini bike list, I wanted to mention a couple honorable mentions. First up being the Coleman Bt 200X. The reason the Coleman Bt 200X did not make my list is just they're pretty new, so they're kind of hard to find a used one online. I have never driven one. I have sat on one that I saw for sale at a store, and they seemed a little short. I almost felt like my knees were too close to the handlebars. But overall, I think they look kind of cool, and I really just don't know enough about them to fairly judge them. Another honorable mention would be the Megamoto Pro. And I think that these are pretty cool bikes. It comes with a 212 Hemi. It comes with front and rear disc brakes. It has front shocks, and it comes with a torque converter. The reason it did not make the list is they are expensive and almost impossible to find used. I've never seen one in my area for sale used. So if you buy one new, they're running almost $900. I've heard a few negative comments about them, or seen a couple of negative videos online. I just don't have any experience with them. Never ridden one or even seen one in person. They seem kind of cool, but just because of the lack of information and availability, I've decided to exclude them from the list. Okay, now the moment we have all been waiting for. My number one choice for top 5 mini bikes is the Baja Db 30, aka Doodlebug. Now I'm just going to start right out with the cons. I would say the largest con is the low ground clearance, coming in at just under 3.5 inches from the kickstand mount to the ground. This makes this bike almost impossible to ride off-road, and believe me, I have tried and have run into roots and or rocks, and it will stop you dead in your tracks. Another con is also the fact that it comes standard with neither front nor rear shocks. You can, however, purchase front shocks. I have not seen anyone successfully modify rear shocks on this bike, but you can get the front shocks. You can buy them online, and they're pretty easy. You don't have to do any welding or anything like that to get them on. One last con I would say about this mini bike is I wish it had a front brake, especially if you're going to beef up the engine. It would just be nice to have that front brake for some extra stopping power. Now, the next feature that I want to point out, it may be a con for some, but it also may be a pro for others, so I'm going to kind of leave this as a neutral, and that is basically the weak stock 2.5 horsepower 97cc engine that the bike comes with. If you got young kids, this is a perfect engine. And that's what I think is what also makes this can be a pro feature. If you're new to mini bikes, or if you have kids and you don't want them to kill themselves, this is a perfect beginner mini bike. But then when you're ready to move up, or to move your kids up to something a little faster, you can swap it out for a Predator 212 or any other Honda GX 200 clone type of engine, and you don't have to do any welding. There's nothing, you don't have to cut anything on the frame. You can just slap it right on there. Moving on with the pros, this mini bike by far, excluding possibly the Baja Warrior, is one of the most easiest to find parts or buy used online. It seems that Coleman has purchased the rights, or the patent expired. I'm really not sure how that works out, but now it seems that this bike is advertised as the Coleman Ct 100U. The Baja Db 30s, they are highly modifiable. You can find just about anything you would want online. This bike is the most user-friendly bike out there. Extremely simple to modify and maintain. Like I said earlier, you can easily slap a 212cc engine on there, or any other type of GX200 clone, without cutting or welding or doing any kind of modification to the frame. I would say this is my top choice because of the availability to find these used, the super low price, the mass availability of aftermarket parts, and it's so simple that anyone can work on these regardless of their mechanical ability or lack thereof. And it's just a great starter mini bike. If you're new to mini bikes, or if you have young children, this is the one to get. They can You can leave if it has a smaller engine when you get it, you can leave it on there for a while until they get used to it. Then you can upgrade it down the road. You can find these things used. I see them all the time, anywhere between as low as 140 to up to about 350. I've seen some of them kind of around 400. It just kind of depends on the mods and the conditions. And you can still buy, like I said, you can buy them new online as well. So there you have it. There is my top 5 mini bikes list. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something. Hope you got some helpful information. Maybe if you're out there considering a mini bike and you're not sure which one you should go for, maybe this video gave you a little guidance. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you have another opinion. Go ahead. Feel free to share in the comments. What do you think? What is your top 5 mini bike list?